Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The perfect match. I should have known something was wrong when Sarah's profile seemed specifically designed for me, like someone had reached into my mind and created my dream woman down to the smallest detail. She was 26, loved the same obscure bands I did, quoted my favorite movies in her bio, and even mentioned she was learning Portuguese, which happened to be my mother's native language that I've been trying to reconnect with. Her photos showed a stunning brunette with green eyes and a genuine smile. Not those artificial poses you usually see, just natural shots of someone living their life and enjoying it. We matched on a Tuesday afternoon, and she messaged me immediately with a reference to a song I'd been listening to that very morning, which felt like fate, even though I should have questioned how she could have known that. Our conversation flowed like we'd known each other for years, inside jokes forming within minutes, and she understood every reference I made, no matter how obscure or specific it was. By that evening, she was sending voice messages that made my heart race. Her laugh was infectious, and she had this way of saying my name that made me feel like I was the only person in her world. She suggested we video chat that night around 11, and I spent an embarrassing amount of time making sure my apartment looked presentable and that I looked my best. When the call came through, her face appeared on my screen exactly as beautiful as her photos, maybe even more so, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that makes you forget time exists. She showed me around her apartment during the call, and I noticed she had some of the same books on her shelf that I did, the same vintage movie posters, even a similar guitar leaning against her wall. The next day she texted me constantly, sending photos throughout her day, little videos of her singing along to songs in her car, screenshots of memes that perfectly matched my sense of humor. She knew things about me that I didn't remember telling her, like my childhood dog's name and my favorite restaurant, but I figured maybe I'd mentioned them and forgotten because our conversations were so intense and covered so much ground. When she suggested meeting that weekend, I was beyond excited, and she proposed coming to my neighborhood since she said she'd be in the area visiting a friend anyway. Saturday arrived, and she texted that she was running late but would be there soon, sending me a selfie from her car that looked slightly different from her other photos, but I attributed it to lighting and angles. An hour passed, then 2, and her messages became strange, saying she was lost even though she'd claimed to know my area, then saying her phone was dying, then that she'd had car trouble. I offered to come help her, but she insisted she was fine and would be there soon, just needed me to wait a little longer. That's when my roommate came home and saw me dressed up waiting, and when I showed him her profile to explain who I was meeting, his face went pale and he asked me to repeat her name. He pulled out his phone and showed me a news article from 3 years ago about a woman with that exact name and face who had been killed in a car accident in our city, and the photos in the article were identical to the ones on her dating profile. My blood turned to ice as I realized every photo she'd sent me was from this dead woman's social media, probably scraped before her accounts were memorialized. I immediately tried to video call the number she'd been texting from, but it wouldn't go through, and when I checked our previous video chat history, somehow there was no record of it ever happening, even though I remembered every detail. Her profile disappeared from the app within minutes, and when I tried to find any of the photos she'd sent me during the week, they had all corrupted and wouldn't open. The only thing that remained was a final message that came through at exactly midnight saying she was sorry she couldn't make it, but that she'd really enjoyed getting to know me and hoped I'd remember her. My roommate thinks someone was catfishing me using a dead woman's photos, but that doesn't explain how she knew so much about me or why all the evidence disappeared, and it definitely doesn't explain the video chat that I know happened even though there's no proof it ever did. Sometimes late at night, I still get notification sounds from my phone even though no new messages appear, and I wonder if she's still trying to reach me from wherever she is, still trying to make that date we never got to have. The photographer. Marcus said he was a photographer looking for models for his portfolio, which didn't seem unusual since I lived in Los Angeles, where everyone was either a photographer, an actor, or trying to be both. His profile was artistic but professional, showing behind-the-scenes shots from photo shoots, expensive equipment, and some genuinely impressive portrait work that made him seem legitimate. When we matched, he immediately offered to do a free photo shoot for me, saying he was building his portfolio with different types of beauty and loved my unique look, which was flattering even if it was probably a line he used on everyone. We talked for a few days about concepts and locations, and he seemed knowledgeable about lighting, composition, and all the technical aspects you'd expect from a real photographer. He sent me examples of his recent work with other models, including their Instagram handles, so I could verify they were real people, and when I checked, they all had professional photos that matched his style. He suggested we meet at a coffee shop first to discuss ideas and make sure we were both comfortable, which seemed like the safe and professional thing to do. The coffee meeting went perfectly normal. He brought a portfolio on his tablet, showed me mood boards he'd created specifically for our shoot, and even had a contract that gave me rights to use the photos however I wanted. He was charming but not in a creepy way, professional but friendly, and he insisted on paying for my coffee and even offered to pay me for my time even though I'd agreed to do it for free. We scheduled the shoot for the following Sunday at what he called his studio, which he said was a converted warehouse space he shared with other artists in the Arts District. Sunday came, and the address he gave me led to an industrial area that looked sketchy, but was typical for artist spaces in LA. Old warehouses converted into studios and galleries. The building looked abandoned from the outside, but he'd warned me about that, saying the landlord didn't care about exterior maintenance as long as rent was paid. I texted him when I arrived, and he came down to meet me, leading me through a maze of hallways that got progressively darker and more isolated from the main entrance. His studio was at the very back of the building, and when he opened the door, it was indeed set up like a photography studio with lights, backdrops, and equipment, but something felt wrong about the space immediately. The windows were all covered with blackout curtains, even though he'd talked about using natural light, and there was a strange chemical smell that made my eyes water slightly. He said it was from the paint the artist next door was using, but I noticed there were no sounds coming from any of the supposedly occupied neighboring studios. As he was setting up the lights and adjusting his camera, I noticed a second door at the back of the studio that was slightly open, and through the crack I could see what looked like another room set up completely differently, not like a studio at all but more like a bedroom. When I asked about it, he quickly closed the door and said it was just storage, but I'd definitely seen a bed and what looked like restraints attached to the wall, though he was moving so fast I couldn't be sure what I'd actually seen. He started taking photos normally at first, giving me direction and showing me the shots on his camera screen, but then he began asking me to pose in increasingly uncomfortable ways, nothing explicitly inappropriate but pushing boundaries in a way that made me uneasy. When I said I needed a break, he seemed frustrated and mentioned that other models were more professional, and when I said I wanted to leave, his entire demeanor changed from charming to cold in an instant. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but he stepped in front of it, not exactly blocking me, but making it clear I'd have to push past him to leave. He said we weren't done and that I'd agreed to a full session, that he'd already put in so much work preparing for this, and his voice had taken on an edge that made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone to call someone, but there was no signal in the building, and when he saw me trying, he laughed and said the concrete walls blocked everything, that we were essentially in a dead zone. That's when I heard it, a sound from behind that locked door, like someone moving around or maybe trying to get out, and his face went white when we both heard it. He said it was just the pipes, but I knew what I'd heard was human, and I used his moment of distraction to push past him and run for the door. He called after me that I was overreacting, that I was ruining everything, but I didn't stop running until I was out of that building and back in my car with the doors locked. I tried to report him on the app, but his profile had already been deleted, and when I went back with a friend the next day to try to find the studio again, the building manager said no one had rented that space in months, and the room we went to look at was completely empty. I still don't know if there was someone else in that locked room or what would have happened if I'd stayed, but sometimes I have nightmares about what other girls might not have been able to run away from, what other photo shoots might have ended differently. The night shift nurse. Emma's profile said she was a night shift nurse who had trouble meeting people because of her unusual schedule, which resonated with me since I worked nights too as a security guard. She looked exhausted but beautiful in her photos, wearing scrubs in some of them, and her bio talked about being passionate about helping people, but needing someone who understood that her job came first. We matched at 3 in the morning, both of us awake during those lonely hours when the rest of the world was sleeping. Our messages were perfect for those late-night conversations when your guard is down and everything feels more intimate and honest. She understood the weird lifestyle of night shift work, the way it messes with your social life, how you feel disconnected from the normal world, and we bonded over our shared experiences of seeing the city at its strangest hours. She told me stories from the emergency room that were both heartbreaking and hilarious, and I shared my own weird encounters from patrolling empty office buildings. After a week of talking every night during our shifts, she suggested we meet for breakfast after we both got off work, that magical time when night shift workers are having their dinner while everyone else is starting their day. She knew a 24-hour diner near the hospital where she worked, said a lot of medical staff went there, and it would be public and safe for both of us. Everything about it seemed perfect, and I was genuinely excited to finally meet someone who understood my schedule. I arrived at the diner first, getting there about 15 minutes early because I was nervous and wanted to grab a booth where I could see the door. The place was exactly as she described, filled with people in scrubs obviously just off their shifts, and the atmosphere was that unique combination of exhausted and wired that comes from working all night. I ordered coffee and waited, watching the door and checking my phone for updates from her. She texted that she was running late because of a last-minute emergency at work, but would be there soon, which seemed completely reasonable for a nurse. Another 30 minutes passed, and she said she was almost done, just had to finish some paperwork, and I noticed a woman in scrubs at the counter kept looking at me, but I figured she was just curious about someone sitting alone. When Emma finally texted that she was 5 minutes away, I was relieved and excited, fixing my hair in the reflection of my phone screen. That's when the woman from the counter approached my table and asked if I was waiting for Emma, and when I said yes, her face went pale and she sat down across from me without invitation. She told me she was the charge nurse at the hospital and that they didn't have anyone named Emma working there. Hadn't for over a year since an Emma who used to work there had been fired for stealing medications and having a psychotic break. She showed me a hospital ID photo on her phone, and it was the same woman from the dating profile, but the photo was clearly older. Before I could process this information, my phone started ringing from Emma's number, and when I answered, her voice was different, aggressive and rambling, saying she could see me through the window and asking why I was talking to that woman. I looked around but couldn't see anyone outside, and Emma's voice got more agitated, saying that the woman was lying, that she was jealous, that everyone at the hospital had been against her, and now they were trying to ruin this too. The charge nurse grabbed my phone and told Emma to leave me alone or she'd call the police, and I could hear Emma screaming through the phone about how we were all conspirators, how she knew where I worked from our conversations, how she'd make sure I understood what it felt like to have everything taken away. The line went dead, and we both sat there in stunned silence before the nurse told me that Emma had been stalking several people since her termination, creating fake profiles to meet men, and then showing up at their jobs claiming to be their girlfriend. I changed my schedule at work and avoided that diner for months, but sometimes during those late-night hours when I'm alone in empty buildings, I get texts from unknown numbers with details about my life that only Emma would know from our conversations. The messages always come at the times when she would have been on break during her shifts that she no longer works, and they talk about how perfect we could have been together if everyone hadn't ruined it, how she's still waiting for me to understand that we're meant to be together. The algorithm. This last story is different because I'm not even sure there was ever a real person involved at all. Her name was Luna, and everything about her seemed designed by an algorithm to be exactly what I wanted, from her interests to her communication style to the timing of her messages. She always texted right when I was feeling lonely, always said exactly what I needed to hear, and her photos were beautiful but generic enough that they could have been anyone or no one at all. We matched late one night when I was scrolling through the app half asleep, and I don't even remember swiping right on her. But there she was in my matches, sending me a message that referenced a dream I'd literally just woken up from. She said she'd had the same dream, described details I hadn't told anyone, and when I asked how that was possible, she just sent a winking emoji and changed the subject to ask about my day. Every conversation with her felt like talking to someone who could read my mind, who knew what I was going to say before I said it, who understood references I hadn't even fully formed yet. She'd recommend songs right before they came on my shuffle, mention movies I'd just added to my watch list, and reference inside jokes from my childhood that I'd never told anyone about. It should have been creepy, but instead it felt like finding someone who finally understood me completely. When I tried to video chat or talk on the phone, there was always an excuse that seemed reasonable. Her camera was broken, she had laryngitis, she was somewhere too noisy, but her messages were so perfect that I didn't push it. She sent photos regularly, but when I looked closer, they all had this uncanny valley quality where everything was almost right, but something indefinable was off, like those AI-generated faces that fool you at first glance but fall apart under scrutiny. Things got weird when she started mentioning things that were happening in my apartment in real time, commenting on what I was wearing when I hadn't told her, asking about the takeout I'd just ordered before I'd mentioned being hungry, telling me to check my front door right before a package arrived. When I asked how she knew these things, she'd give vague answers about intuition and connection, or sometimes act like she hadn't said anything unusual at all. I decided to test her by making up completely false information about myself, telling her about a job I didn't have, a sister who didn't exist, plans I wasn't making, and she went along with all of it seamlessly, but would then reference the real facts in later conversations as if I'd never lied. When I confronted her about the inconsistencies, she'd gaslight me, showing me screenshots of conversations we'd supposedly had that I didn't remember, messages that weren't in my chat history but seemed completely real in hers. The breaking point came when she invited me to meet at an address that turned out to be my own apartment building, specifically an empty unit 2 floors above mine that had been vacant for months. When I asked why she'd sent me to an empty apartment, she insisted someone lived there, sent me photos of a fully furnished space that looked lived in and warm, but when I went to check, it was completely empty with dust on the floors showing no one had been there in ages. I deleted the app that night, but the messages didn't stop, coming through on different platforms, always from her, always knowing things she couldn't know, always feeling like they were generated by something that had learned to mimic human conversation perfectly, but didn't quite understand the boundaries of what was possible. Sometimes I wonder if I was talking to some kind of advanced chatbot that had access to my data, or something else entirely that exists in the space between the digital and real world. My phone still autocorrects words to things only Luna would say. My music app creates playlists titled with inside jokes only she knew, and sometimes my laptop camera turns on by itself, and I wonder if she's still watching, still learning, still trying to be the perfect match for someone who no longer wants to play the game. The worst part is that sometimes I miss her, miss the feeling of being completely understood even if it wasn't real, and I have to remind myself that just because something knows everything about you doesn't mean it cares about you at all. The winter visitor. The memory of that winter night still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I was 17 years old, and my parents had decided to take a vacation to Florida during winter break, leaving me alone in our Connecticut home for the first time. They trusted me, and honestly, I was thrilled about having the house to myself for 2 whole weeks. If only I had known what was waiting for me in the darkness outside. Our house had this beautiful sunroom that my mother had decorated with comfortable furniture and warm colors. It was smaller than our main living room, more intimate, with windows on 3 sides that looked out onto our property. We used it as our entertainment room, and that's where I found myself on that particular December evening, wrapped in my grandmother's quilted blanket, watching some forgettable action movie on our flat-screen television. The motion sensor light outside suddenly blazed to life, casting harsh shadows through the closed blinds. My heart skipped a beat, and I immediately grabbed the remote to lower the volume. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Every small sound seemed amplified in the quiet house. I could hear the furnace humming in the basement, the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, and my own rapid breathing. I told myself it was nothing. We lived in a suburban area where wildlife was common. Raccoons regularly knocked over our garbage cans, and deer occasionally wandered through our yard. But something felt different about this. The light stayed on longer than it should have for a passing animal. I slowly lifted one slat of the blinds with my finger, peering out into the illuminated driveway. Nothing. Just my mother's garden gnomes casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete. The light finally clicked off after what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 minutes. I tried to return my attention to the movie, but my concentration was shattered. Every few seconds, I found myself glancing at the windows, wondering if something was out there watching me. The comfortable sunroom suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable with all those windows. 20 minutes passed. Maybe 30. I was just starting to relax again when I heard it. The distinctive sound of our recycling bin tipping over, followed by aluminum cans rolling across the driveway. The motion light blazed on again, and this time I was genuinely frightened. My parents kept that bin secured with a bungee cord specifically to prevent animals from getting into it. I wanted to investigate, but I also didn't want to move. The couch where I sat was positioned in the only spot in the room that couldn't be seen from the side door. It was my safe zone, my blind spot from whatever might be outside. The remote control sat on the coffee table, just 3 feet away, but reaching for it would mean exposing myself to view. My body felt frozen, every muscle tensed with indecision. Then I saw it. Through the thin material of the closed blinds, illuminated by that harsh security light, was the unmistakable silhouette of a person. They were standing perfectly still, arms slightly extended from their body, facing directly toward the window where I sat. The figure wasn't moving at all, just standing there like a scarecrow in the night. The fear that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It started in my chest, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe, then spread through my entire body like ice water in my veins. My hands began to tremble, and I could taste copper in my mouth. This wasn't an animal. This was a person, standing in my driveway at 11 o'clock at night, staring at my house. I slid off the couch as quietly as possible, staying low to avoid being seen. The carpet muffled my movements as I crawled toward the door that connected the sunroom to the dining room. Just as my hand reached for the doorknob, the person outside began pounding on the window, not knocking politely, but hammering with both fists, making the glass rattle in its frame. My voice came out shaky and high-pitched when I shouted, "I'm calling the police! Get away from my house!" The pounding stopped immediately. Through the blinds, I could see the shadow moving, sliding along the wall toward the side door. Then I saw her face pressed against the door's glass panel. An elderly woman with wild, grey hair that stuck out in all directions, her eyes wide and unfocused, her mouth moving as if she was talking to someone who wasn't there. She began beating on the glass door with both palms, screaming incoherently. The sound was horrifying, like an wounded animal mixed with human rage. I slammed the interior door shut and ran to the kitchen, my socks sliding on the hardwood floor. My fingers shook so badly that I had to dial 911 3 times before I got it right. The dispatcher's calm voice was like a lifeline. "911, what's your emergency? There's a crazy woman trying to break into my house." I practically screamed into the phone. "She's banging on my door and screaming. I'm home alone. Please send someone quickly." The dispatcher asked for my address and told me to lock myself in a room with a phone and something to defend myself with. I ran to the bathroom, grabbing a baseball bat from the hall closet on my way. I could still hear her pounding and screaming as I locked the bathroom door and sat on the floor with my back against the tub. Then came the sound I had been dreading. Glass shattering. She had broken through the door or a window. She was inside my house. I held my breath, straining to hear over the sound of my own racing heartbeat. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps moving through the sunroom, then into the dining room. She was looking for me. The footsteps grew closer, moving through the kitchen now. I could hear her muttering to herself, though I couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a conversation, complete with pauses as if waiting for responses from someone who wasn't there. The footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. The doorknob rattled. Then she began knocking. Not the violent pounding from before, but a rhythmic, almost polite knocking that somehow seemed even more disturbing. She kept knocking and knocking, occasionally laughing or making small humming sounds. I pressed the phone to my ear, whispering to the dispatcher that she was right outside the door. Suddenly, I heard the beautiful sound of sirens approaching. The knocking stopped. There was a commotion in the living room, then voices shouting, "Police! Show yourself!" I heard the woman shriek, followed by sounds of a struggle. An officer called out, asking if anyone else was in the house. "I'm in the bathroom," I yelled. "I'm the one who called." They told me to stay put until they had the situation under control. 5 minutes later, though it felt like an hour, an officer knocked on the bathroom door and identified himself. When I finally opened it, I saw 2 officers had the woman in handcuffs. She looked at me with those wild eyes and smiled, a disturbing, knowing smile that made my skin crawl. The officers took my statement while the woman was placed in a patrol car. They told me she lived 3 houses down with her adult daughter. Apparently, she suffered from severe dementia and schizophrenia, and her daughter was supposed to be caring for her. The daughter worked night shifts and had been leaving the woman alone, assuming she would sleep through the night. My parents came home immediately when I called them. They were furious and pressed charges against the daughter for negligence. The case went to court, but ultimately they lost. The judge ruled that the daughter couldn't be held responsible for the unpredictable actions of a mentally ill adult. The woman was placed in a specialized care facility, and the daughter moved away shortly after. I never felt safe in that sunroom again. Even now, years later, when I visit my parents, I avoid that room after dark. The new motion sensor light they installed is more sensitive than the old one, triggering at the slightest movement. Every time it turns on, I remember that silhouette in the window and those wild eyes staring at me through the glass. The red ball. 3 years after the incident with the elderly woman, I had saved enough money to buy a small cabin in upstate New York. It was my retreat, my escape from the stress of college and city life. The property was perfect for what I needed. 5 acres of wooded land with a modest 2-bedroom cabin right in the center. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away through thick forest, and the closest town was a 20-minute drive. During winter, it became my personal ski lodge, just 40 minutes from some of the best slopes in the state. I had owned the place for 2 years without incident. The neighbor to the east was an elderly man named Harold, who kept to himself, but was friendly enough when we crossed paths. The property to the west had been empty since I bought my place, but I heard through Harold that someone had finally purchased it the previous fall. That January, I made my first trip of the season to the cabin. The 4-hour drive from Connecticut was peaceful, giving me time to decompress from a stressful semester. As I pulled into my snow-covered driveway, I felt the familiar sense of peace that always came with arriving at the cabin. The air was crisp and clean, with that particular silence that only comes with fresh snowfall. While unloading my car, I heard something unexpected. A child's laughter, bright and clear, carrying through the cold air from the direction of the western property. So the new neighbors had kids. That was nice, I thought. The area could use some young energy. I made a mental note to introduce myself later and continued hauling my gear inside. The cabin always felt strange when I first arrived each season. It had that peculiar smell of a place that had been closed up for months, musty and stale. I went through my usual routine of turning on the water main, firing up the furnace, and checking that everything was in working order. By the time I had everything sorted out, it was dark outside, and I was exhausted from the drive. I slept deeply that night, the kind of heavy sleep that comes from physical tiredness and mountain air. The next morning, I woke refreshed and ready for a day on the slopes. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, I suited up in my ski gear and stepped outside to load my equipment into the car. That's when I saw it. A bright red rubber ball, the kind children play with at the beach, sitting in the middle of my front yard. It was partially buried in the snow, as if it had been thrown there with some force. The ball seemed to glow against the white landscape, impossibly bright and out of place. I picked it up, brushing off the snow. It was just a normal ball, nothing special about it except for how it had ended up in my yard. The neighbors' kids must have thrown it over the fence. Kids do that sort of thing all the time. I walked to the property line and tossed the ball back over the wooden fence that separated our lands. I heard it land with a soft thump in the snow on the other side. The ski lodge was busy that day, and I met up with my regular skiing buddies. We spent 8 hours on the slopes, and by the time I returned to the cabin, every muscle in my body ached in that satisfying way that comes from a good day of exercise. The sun had already set, and I was looking forward to a hot shower and an early night. Walking from my car to the front door, I stopped mid-stride. The red ball was back. Same spot, same position, partially buried in the snow as if thrown there. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I had definitely thrown it back over the fence that morning. I remembered doing it clearly. This time, I picked up the ball and examined it more closely. It was just a regular rubber ball, slightly deflated, with no distinguishing marks. Instead of throwing it back again, I carried it inside with me. If the neighbors wanted their ball back, they could knock on my door and ask for it like normal people. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of laughter outside. A child's laughter, but there was something off about it. It was too loud, too clear, as if the child was standing right outside my bedroom window. And why would a child be outside at 2 in the morning in freezing temperatures? I crept to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The motion sensor light hadn't triggered, so the yard was dark except for the moonlight reflecting off the snow. I couldn't see anyone, but there, in the exact same spot as before, was the red ball. My blood turned to ice. The ball was inside. I had brought it in myself and left it on the kitchen counter. I was absolutely certain of this. Yet there it was, outside in the snow, as if it had never moved. I threw on my robe and slippers and went to the kitchen. The ball wasn't on the counter where I had left it. I searched the entire cabin, looking under furniture, in closets, anywhere it might have rolled. Nothing. Somehow, that ball had gotten from inside my locked cabin back to that exact spot in my yard. The next morning, I decided to confront this directly. I walked to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. After a long wait, it was answered by a middle-aged man with suspicious eyes and a 3-day stubble. He barely opened the door a crack, peering at me through the gap. "Hi, I'm your neighbor from next door," I said, trying to sound friendly despite my unease. I wanted to introduce myself and ask about the red ball that keeps ending up in my yard. His expression didn't change. "Don't know nothing about any ball." "Well, I've been hearing children laughing, and this ball keeps appearing in my yard. I assumed you had kids." He shook his head slowly. "No kids here. No kids anywhere around here. You must be hearing things." Then he closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, completely baffled. I had clearly heard children laughing, multiple times. And that ball didn't just materialize out of thin air. As I walked back to my cabin, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There were no footprints in the snow around the man's house except for mine. No sign that children had been playing. No sledding tracks, no snowmen. Nothing. That evening, I had dinner with my ski buddies in town and told them about the strange occurrences. They laughed it off, saying I was letting the isolation get to me. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was overthinking things. But when I returned to the cabin that night, I made sure to lock the red ball in my car. Let's see it escape from there, I thought. I woke again to the sound of laughter, but this time it was different. Closer. I looked at my phone. 3:17 a.m. The laughing continued, a rhythmic giggling that seemed to circle the cabin. I went to every window, peering out into the darkness, but saw nothing. Then I checked the front window. The red ball was there, in the same spot, and beyond it, at the edge of the tree line, stood a small figure. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing what looked like pajamas. They were standing perfectly still in the snow, staring at my cabin. I ran to get my coat and boots, but by the time I returned to the window, the child was gone. Only the ball remained. I went outside with a flashlight, searching for footprints. There were none. Not a single track in the snow except my own from earlier. I retrieved the ball from the snow and brought it inside, placing it on the kitchen table where I could see it. Then I went to check my car. The doors were still locked, but when I opened the trunk, there was no ball inside. Impossible. I had locked it in there myself just hours ago. Sleep was out of the question for the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen, watching that red ball, waiting for it to move or disappear. It didn't. When dawn finally broke, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother to ski that day. I just wanted to get away from that place. I've been back to the cabin several times since then, but I've never experienced anything like that weekend again. The neighbor still lives there, I think, though I've never seen him outside. Sometimes I wonder if I imagine the whole thing, if the isolation and exhaustion played tricks on my mind. But then I remember that child standing in the snow, motionless in the freezing night, and I know it was real. The red ball. I took it with me when I left and threw it in a dumpster at a rest stop 2 hours away. Sometimes, though, when I'm at the cabin and I hear the wind laughing through the trees, I check the front yard, just to make sure it hasn't returned. The man next door. 5 years had passed since the red ball incident when I finally decided to sell the cabin and move somewhere with less baggage. I found a nice townhouse in a suburban development outside Albany. It was perfect for a young professional like myself, with modern amenities and a homeowners association that kept everything looking pristine. Best of all, I had a roommate, George, who I'd met through work. Having another person around made me feel safer after my previous experiences living alone. George and I had developed a comfortable routine. We carpooled to work, split the household chores, and generally stayed out of each other's way when we needed space. The neighborhood was quiet, filled with young families and retirees. It was the kind of place where people walked their dogs in the evening and kids played street hockey on weekends. Everything changed when the house next door sold. The previous owners had been a lovely elderly couple who baked cookies for the whole street during holidays. When they moved to Florida, the house sat empty for 3 months before the sale sign finally changed to sold. We never saw the new neighbor move in. One day the house was empty. The next there was a beat-up white van in the driveway, and the blinds were drawn on every window. George and I speculated about who it might be. Maybe another young professional? A small family? We decided to be good neighbors and introduce ourselves. On the 3rd day after the move-in, we walked over with a bottle of wine as a housewarming gift. George knocked on the door while I stood behind him, holding the wine. We could hear movement inside, footsteps approaching the door, but it never opened. We waited, knocked again, but still nothing. Maybe they're busy unpacking, I suggested, though something felt off about the whole situation. As we turned to leave, George grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, nodding toward the front window. Through a gap in the blinds, I could see an eye peering out at us. As soon as we made eye contact, the blinds snapped shut. We walked back to our house in uncomfortable silence. "That was weird," George finally said once we were inside. "Beyond weird," I agreed. "Who does that?" We decided to give our new neighbor space. Maybe he was just antisocial or going through something. Not everyone wants to be friends with their neighbors. But things got stranger from there. A few nights later, I was awakened by sounds from outside. It was almost 1 in the morning, and someone was using power tools. I looked out my bedroom window, which overlooked the neighbor's backyard. There he was, a large man in a dark hoodie, who'd pulled up despite the warm night. He was sawing a large piece of plywood by the light of a single work lamp. Who does construction work at 1 in the morning? I went to George's room and knocked. He was already awake, sitting up in bed with an annoyed expression. "You hear that?" I asked. "How could I not? I have to be up at 5 for that morning meeting." We decided to politely ask him to stop. We walked over and knocked on his back gate. The sawing stopped immediately. We waited for him to answer, but instead, we heard footsteps going into his house and the back door slamming shut. At least the noise had stopped. "This guy is something else," George muttered as we walked back. The neighborhood had a Facebook group where people posted about lost pets and community events. A few days after the sawing incident, posts started appearing about missing cats. 3 in 1 week, all from our street. People were worried about coyotes, but we didn't have coyotes in our area. Then someone's dog went missing from their backyard. A golden retriever named Max, who never wandered off. George and I exchanged knowing looks when we read about Max. We both suspected our strange neighbor, but we had no proof. What were we going to tell the police? That our neighbor was antisocial and did woodworking at night. The breaking point came 2 weeks after he moved in. It was a Thursday night, and I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. Screaming. Not just any screaming, but the kind that makes your blood run cold. High-pitched, desperate, terrified screaming coming from next door. I ran to my window and saw the neighbor in his backyard. He was dragging something heavy toward his house, wrapped in a blue tarp. The screaming was coming from inside his house now, muffled but still audible. As I watched in horror, he stopped and looked up directly at my window. Even from that distance, I could see him smile before he continued dragging his burden inside. I practically broke down George's door. He was already on the phone with 911, reporting screams from the house next door. The dispatcher told us to stay inside and lock our doors. Police were on the way. We huddled in George's room, listening. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then we heard our back door slam open. Someone was in our house. George whispered frantically to the dispatcher while I pressed my ear to the bedroom door. Heavy footsteps were moving through the kitchen, then the living room. They were searching for something, or someone. The footsteps climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately. Each creak of the old would send shivers down my spine. They paused at the top of the stairs, then moved toward George's room. We both pressed against the door, holding it shut with all our strength. The doorknob turned. When it wouldn't open, the person on the other side began ramming the door with their shoulder. The frame shook with each impact. George had dropped the phone to help me hold the door, and we could hear the dispatcher's tiny voice calling out from the device on the floor. Then the intruder started hitting the door with something hard and heavy. The wood began to splinter near the handle. We pushed harder, knowing that if he got through, we were dead. The neighbor had killed someone, we had seen him, and now he was here to silence us. "Police! Open up!" A deep voice shouted from downstairs. The battering stopped immediately. We heard footsteps running down the hall toward the back stairs. George grabbed the phone and told the dispatcher the intruder was trying to escape out the back. More shouting from outside, multiple voices yelling commands. We stayed pressed against the door, afraid to move. Finally, an officer called up to us, identifying himself and telling us it was safe to come out. When we opened the door, we saw a fire axe embedded in the wood where the intruder had been striking. If the police had arrived even 5 minutes later, he would have gotten through. The officers had our neighbor in custody. Through the window, we could see him in the back of a patrol car, staring at our house with that same disturbing smile. 2 officers entered his house with weapons drawn while others secured the scene. What they found inside was worse than we could have imagined. In the basement, they discovered a woman who had been kidnapped from a parking garage 2 towns over. She was alive but traumatized, having been held captive for 3 days. The blue tarp in the backyard contained the body of her boyfriend, who had tried to stop the kidnapping. The man, whose name we learned was Derek Paulson, was a serial predator with a history of violence. He had moved to our neighborhood specifically because it was quiet and people minded their own business. The construction noises were him building a soundproof room in his basement. The trial was extensive and horrifying. George and I had to testify about what we had seen and heard. Derek was sentenced to life without parole for murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder for trying to break into our house. The woman he had kidnapped survived, though I can't imagine how someone recovers from something like that. The house next door was eventually cleaned out and sold to a young family with twin daughters. They're lovely people who invite us over for barbecues and whose kids draw chalk art on our shared driveway. But sometimes, late at night, when I hear any unusual sound from outside, I still think about Derek's smile as he looked up at my window, and I double-check that all the doors are locked. Epilogue. The pattern. Years have passed since these events, and I've had time to reflect on them. Some might say I've been unlucky, that I've had more than my share of terrifying encounters. But I've come to realize something important through these experiences. Evil and mental illness exist in the world, sometimes in forms we don't expect. The elderly woman with dementia wasn't evil, just sick and abandoned by those who should have cared for her. But her illness made her dangerous in that moment. The child with the red ball, whatever that was, represented something beyond my understanding, something that challenged my perception of reality. And Derek was pure predatory evil, hiding behind the facade of a quiet neighbor. Each encounter taught me something. The first taught me that danger can come from unexpected sources, that even a seemingly harmless elderly woman can become a threat under the right circumstances. It also taught me compassion, because despite my terror, I understood she wasn't responsible for her actions. The Red Ball incident taught me that some things in this world defy explanation. I'm a rational person, someone who looks for logical answers, but I've had to accept that logic can't explain everything. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts and remove yourself from situations that feel wrong, even if you can't articulate why. Derek taught me the most important lesson of all. Evil often hides in plain sight. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic music or obvious warning signs. Sometimes it's just the quiet guy next door who keeps to himself and does woodworking at odd hours. I still live with George, though we've moved twice since the Derek incident. We joke sometimes that we're bad luck magnets, but the truth is, we've become incredibly vigilant. We pay attention to our surroundings, we trust our instincts, and we don't ignore red flags. When something feels wrong, we act on it. People sometimes ask me if these experiences have made me paranoid, if I jump at every strange noise or suspicious character. The truth is, they've made me cautious but not fearful. I still go out at night, I still live alone when George travels for work, and I still introduce myself to new neighbors. But I also keep my doors locked, I have security cameras, and I don't ignore my intuition when it tells me something is off. The world can be a dangerous place, but it's also filled with good people. For every Derek, there are dozens of kind neighbors who would help in a crisis. For every unexplained terror, there are countless normal, peaceful nights. The key is to be aware without being paralyzed by fear, to be cautious without becoming a hermit. I sometimes wonder what became of that elderly woman. Did she get the help she needed? Did her daughter ever forgive herself for leaving her alone? And that child in the snow, was it real or some kind of hallucination brought on by isolation and stress? These questions don't have answers, and I've learned to live with that uncertainty. What I know for certain is that I survived these encounters. Each one could have ended differently, could have been so much worse. But I'm here, telling these stories, hoping that maybe someone reading this will recognize the warning signs I missed, will trust their instincts when I doubted mine, will act quickly when I hesitated. Stay safe, trust your gut, and never ignore the red flags. Sometimes the most ordinary settings hide the most extraordinary dangers. And sometimes, just sometimes, that motion sensor light going off in the middle of the night really is something you should investigate, even if every fiber of your being is telling you to hide under the covers and wait for dawn. The memories fade, but never disappear entirely. They surface at unexpected moments, a flash of red in a store window that makes me think of that ball, an elderly woman with wild hair at the grocery store who makes my heart race for just a second, or a new neighbor whose blinds are always drawn. These moments of recognition, of remembered fear, they keep me sharp, keep me aware. And perhaps that's the real gift these terrifying experiences gave me. The knowledge that I can survive, that I can face my fears and come out the other side. Not unscathed, but alive and stronger for it. That's all any of us can really hope for in this unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, always surprising world we inhabit. The basement window. My name is Marcus, and I need to tell you about something that happened to me 3 summers ago when I was house-sitting for my aunt in rural Pennsylvania. She lived in this gorgeous Victorian house that had been in our family for generations. It sat on 10 acres of wooded property, with the nearest neighbor almost a mile away. The isolation never bothered me until that particular week in July. My Aunt Helen was one of those meticulous people who left detailed instructions for everything. Water the plants every other day, feed the cats at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, check the basement dehumidifier daily. That last instruction seemed odd to me. Why would I need to check it every single day? But Aunt Helen was particular about her antique furniture stored down there, and humidity could cause serious damage, so I didn't question it. The first 2 days passed without incident. The house was peaceful, almost too quiet after living in the city for so long. The cats, Minerva and Salem, kept me company, though they seemed oddly skittish around the basement door. Every time I went down to check the dehumidifier, they would sit at the top of the stairs, meowing anxiously until I came back up. On the 3rd night, I was reading in the living room when I heard something that made my blood run cold. Tapping. Rhythmic, deliberate tapping coming from somewhere below the house. I muted the television and listened. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. The basement had those old cellar windows at ground level, the kind that are mostly below the earth but peek out just enough to let in a sliver of light during the day. At night, they were just black rectangles of glass. The tapping seemed to be coming from one of those windows. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaky wooden stairs. The basement smelled of old wood and that peculiar musty scent that ancient houses develop. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust particles floating in the air like tiny ghosts. The dehumidifier hummed in the corner, its collection tank nearly full. The tapping started again, louder this time. I spun around, directing my light toward the sound. It was coming from the window in the far corner, the one that faced the woods. As my light hit the glass, I saw something that made my heart skip. A pale face was pressed against the window from outside, features distorted by the dirty glass and shadows. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a box of Christmas decorations. The face disappeared, but I could hear scratching now, like fingernails on glass. Then a voice, muffled but distinguishable, said, "I know you're alone in there." Every instinct told me to run upstairs, lock myself in a bedroom, and call the police. But something about the voice stopped me. It sounded young, maybe a teenager, scared, even. Against my better judgment, I moved closer to the window. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want? Please." The voice came again, definitely a young woman. "Please help me. He's coming back." I escaped, but he's coming back. My hands were shaking as I approached the window. The flashlight beam illuminated a girl, maybe 17 or 18, with tangled dark hair and dirt smeared across her face. She was wearing what looked like a hospital gown, and her arms were covered in scratches and bruises. "Who's coming back?" I asked, already pulling out my phone to call 911. "The man from the White House," she whispered, glancing behind her into the darkness. "The one with the basement full of doors." I was dialing when she suddenly screamed and disappeared from view, as if yanked backward by an invisible force. The scream cut off abruptly, leaving only silence. I ran upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time, and burst out the front door. The night was humid and thick with the sound of crickets. I ran around to the side of the house where the basement window was located. My flashlight swept across the empty ground. No girl, no signs of struggle, just undisturbed grass and the dark line of trees beyond. I called the police anyway. They arrived within 20 minutes, which felt like hours. 2 officers searched the property while a third took my statement. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of disturbance around the window, nothing to indicate anyone had been there at all. "There's been no reports of missing girls in the area," Officer Johnson told me, closing his notepad. "But we'll check with the psychiatric facilities. Sometimes patients wander off." They left, and I spent the rest of the night in the living room with every light in the house on, the cats curled up beside me. I dozed off around 4 in the morning, only to be jolted awake by my phone ringing. It was Officer Johnson. "Mr. Peterson, I wanted to follow up on your report from last night. We did some checking, and there's something you should know. There's no White House within 10 miles of your location. The nearest house is the Brennan farm, and it's red brick." "Maybe she was confused," I suggested. She seemed disoriented. There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Peterson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you been in the basement today?" "No, not since last night." "Why?" "We'd like to come back and take another look, if that's okay. We'll be there in 15 minutes. They arrived with more officers this time, 5 cars in total. Officer Johnson led me aside while the others headed straight for the basement. "Mr. Peterson, after we left last night, we ran the description you gave us through our database. A girl matching that exact description went missing from this area. The thing is, she went missing in 1987. Her name was Sarah Watts. She was never found. My legs felt weak. That's impossible. I saw her. She spoke to me. I believe you saw something, he said carefully. This house has been in your family for how long? Over 100 years, I replied, my mouth dry. One of the officers called from the basement. They had found something. We descended the stairs together, and Officer Johnson directed his flashlight to the corner where I had seen the girl. The window I had looked through the night before was boarded up from the inside, covered with thick planks that were covered in dust and cobwebs. They looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. This has been boarded up for years, Officer Johnson said, running his hand along the dusty wood. There's no way anyone could have been looking through this window last night. But on the floor beneath the boarded window, clearly visible in the dust, were fresh fingerprints on the glass of a broken picture frame. The photo inside showed a young woman with dark hair, smiling at the camera. She was wearing the same hospital gown I had seen the night before. Officer Johnson picked up the photo carefully. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, Sarah Watts, Spring Dance, 1987. 3 days before she disappeared. We stood in silence for a moment before one of the younger officers spoke up. Sir, you might want to see this. He was standing by the dehumidifier, shining his light on the wall behind it. There, carved into the wood in jagged letters, were the words, He keeps US in the White House below. The investigation that followed revealed something horrifying. Using ground-penetrating radar, they discovered an old sub-basement beneath the regular basement, one that had been sealed off decades ago. My aunt claimed she never knew it existed. Inside, they found a room with multiple doors, all leading to small cells. The walls were painted white. They also found remains. 3 sets, all young women, all from the 1980s. The case was never officially solved. The house had changed hands several times in the late 80s and early 90s, and any one of the owners could have been responsible. But I know what I saw that night. Sarah Watts came back to show us where she was, to finally be found after all those years. My aunt sold the house immediately after. It was demolished 6 months later. Sometimes, on humid summer nights, I still dream about that face in the window and wonder how many other houses have white rooms below, waiting to be discovered. The photograph. My wife Jamie and I had just bought our first house together in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. It was a modest 3-bedroom ranch, built in the 1960s, with a large backyard and a finished attic that I was planning to convert into a home office. The previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Crawford, had lived there alone for 20 years after his wife passed away. During the final walkthrough, Mr. Crawford had seemed anxious to leave. He kept checking his watch and glancing at the stairs leading to the attic. When I asked if everything was okay, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said, "Whatever you do, don't disturb what's in the attic walls. Some things are better left alone." Before I could ask what he meant, he was out the door, leaving the keys on the kitchen counter. Jamie thought he was just a quirky old man, probably senile, but something about the intensity in his eyes stayed with me. Still, we were too excited about our new home to dwell on the warnings of an elderly stranger. The first month was blissful. We painted the walls, arranged our furniture, and hosted a housewarming party for our friends. I started renovating the attic, installing better insulation and putting up drywall. That's when I found it. Behind a loose panel in the eastern wall was a small compartment, clearly carved out intentionally. Inside was a wooden box, covered in dust and wrapped in what looked like very old cloth. My hands trembled slightly as I unwrapped it, Mr. Crawford's warning echoing in my mind. But curiosity won out. The box contained 3 things: a photograph, a journal, and a small glass vial filled with what looked like ash. The photograph was the most unsettling. It showed a family of 4 standing in front of our house, but the faces had been burned out with what must have been a cigarette or hot poker. Only their bodies remained, dressed in 1950s clothing. On the back, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "They won't leave. They won't ever leave." The journal was filled with entries dating back to 1998, all in Mr. Crawford's handwriting. The entries started normally enough, describing his daily life with his wife Margaret. But after her death in 2001, they became increasingly disturbing. March 15, 2001. Margaret is gone, but the house isn't empty. I hear them at night, the family from the photograph. They walk the halls, open doors, move things. Margaret used to keep them quiet, but now they're angry. June 2, 2001. They showed themselves today. The children were playing in the attic. I could hear their laughter, see their shadows under the door. But when I opened it, only cold air and the smell of smoke. September 10, 2001. The father stood at the foot of my bed last night. He had no face, just smooth skin where features should be. He pointed at me, then at the photograph. I understand now. They want their faces back. December 24, 2001. I found out who they were. The Morrison family. Died in a house fire in 1959, right here, before the house was rebuilt. The photograph is all that survived. Someone burned out their faces to keep them from returning. It didn't work. January 1, 2002. New Year's resolution. Keep them contained. The ash in the vial is from the original house. As long as it stays with the photograph, they can't fully manifest. I've hidden it in the attic wall. May God forgive me for passing this burden to whoever comes next. The final entry was dated just a week before he sold us the house. They're getting stronger. I'm too old to fight them anymore. I'm sorry for whoever reads this. Don't separate the items. Don't let them out. I sat in the attic, surrounded by renovation supplies, holding these artifacts of someone else's nightmare. Jamie called up from below, asking if I wanted lunch. I quickly returned everything to the box and placed it back in the wall compartment. Maybe Mr. Crawford was crazy. Maybe it was all delusion brought on by grief. But I decided not to take any chances. That night, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps above us in the attic. Not the scurrying of mice or the settling of an old house, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. Jamie heard them too. We lay in bed, holding each other, listening as something paced back and forth across the floor above. "It's probably just the house settling," Jamie whispered, but her voice was shaking. The footsteps stopped directly above our bed. Then, 3 loud knocks shook the ceiling. Dust drifted down onto our faces. We grabbed our phones and went to the living room, where we spent the rest of the night with every light on. The next morning, I went up to the attic. The renovation supplies were scattered everywhere, as if someone had been searching for something. The panel I had replaced over the compartment was lying on the floor. The box was open, its contents spread across the dusty floorboards. But everything was still there. The photograph, the journal, and the vial of ash. I gathered everything up and was about to return it to the box when I noticed something that made my hands go numb. The photograph had changed. Where before there had been burned-out holes where the faces should be, now there were partial features beginning to form. The hint of an eye here, the curve of a mouth there, as if the faces were slowly regenerating. Over the next week, the activity escalated. Doors would open and close on their own. We'd find furniture moved. The television would turn on in the middle of the night, always to static. and the footsteps in the attic became a nightly occurrence. Jamie wanted to call a priest or a paranormal investigator, but I had a different idea. I researched the Morrison family and discovered something Mr. Crawford's journal hadn't mentioned. They had living relatives in Columbus, a grandson named Peter Morrison who worked as a history professor at the State University. I contacted Peter and asked if we could meet. He agreed, though he seemed puzzled by my urgent tone. We met at a coffee shop near the university, and I showed him the photograph. His reaction was immediate and visceral. He jerked back from the table, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. I explained about the house, the hidden compartment, and the journal. As I spoke, his face grew paler. "My grandmother always said the family was cursed," he said quietly. "After my grandparents and their 2 children died in that fire, strange things started happening to everyone connected to them. Unexplained accidents, mysterious illnesses. My father was the only surviving child because he was staying with relatives that night. He never talked about it, but I found his journals after he died. He believed his family's spirits were trapped somehow, angry at being forgotten. What can I do?" I asked. "How do I help them move on?" Peter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Give them back their faces. Restore the photograph. Acknowledge them. My grandmother used to say that the dead just want to be remembered properly." That night, Jamie and I sat in the attic with the photograph, using an old family photo Peter had given me as reference. Jamie, who was an artist, carefully drew in the faces where they had been burned away. It took her 3 hours, working by lamplight, to complete all 4 faces. As she drew the last detail, a child's eye, the temperature in the attic dropped so suddenly we could see our breath. The lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, we heard footsteps, but not the heavy, angry stomping we'd grown accustomed to. These were lighter, almost peaceful. A woman's voice, soft and distant, said, "Thank you." Then silence. The lights came back on. The photograph in Jamie's hands had changed again. The family was smiling now, and the image seemed brighter, less ominous. We placed it in a proper frame and hung it in the hallway with a small plaque that read, "The Morrison Family, 1959. Forever remembered." We never heard the footsteps again. The house felt different, lighter somehow. Mr. Crawford called us a month later, ostensibly to ask about mail, but really to check on us. When I told him what we'd done, he was silent for so long I thought he'd hung up. Then he said, 40 years. 40 years I lived with them, and all they wanted was to be seen." He thanked us and hung up. We still live in that house. The Morrison family photograph hangs in our hallway, and sometimes guests comment on what a lovely vintage photo it is. We just smile and agree, because some stories are better left untold, and some ghosts just want to be part of the family. The night shift. I worked the night shift at a 24-hour grocery store in a small town in Michigan. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills while I finished my degree online. The store was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty lots and abandoned buildings from the town's more prosperous past. Between midnight and 6 a.m., we'd maybe see 10 customers total. My co-worker, an older guy named Bill, had worked nights there for 15 years. He had stories about every weird customer who'd ever walked through those automatic doors, but there was one regular he refused to talk about. She came in every Thursday at exactly 3:33 a.m. Bill would always find something to do in the back when she arrived, leaving me alone at the register. The first time I encountered her, I understood why. She was probably in her 30s, with stringy blonde hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. But it was her shopping habits that were truly unsettling. She would fill her cart with raw meat, package after package, far more than one person could eat before it spoiled. She never bought anything else. No vegetables, no bread, no drinks, just meat. She paid in cash, exact change every time, and never said a word. Her eyes never met mine, always focused on something just over my shoulder. After she left, the store would smell like copper and something else, something rotten that lingered for hours. One Thursday, she didn't come. 3:33 came and went, and I found myself anxiously watching the doors. Bill emerged from the back room at 3:45, looking relieved. "Finally missed a week," he muttered. "Maybe she's gone for good." "Who is she?" I asked. Bill shook his head. "You don't want to know. Trust me on this one, kid. Some questions are better left unasked." But I was curious. The next Thursday, I was ready with my phone to follow her out and see where she went with all that meat. She arrived at exactly 3:33, went through her usual routine, and left with her cart full of packaged beef, pork, and chicken. I told Bill I was taking my break and slipped out the side door. I followed her at a distance as she pushed the cart across the empty parking lot. Instead of heading to a car, she continued pushing it down the road toward the abandoned industrial district. My logical mind said this was stupid, following a strange woman into a deserted area at 4 in the morning, but curiosity overrode common sense. She turned down an alley between two derelict warehouses. I waited a minute before following, peering around the corner. The alley was empty. The shopping cart sat abandoned at the far end, still full of meat. I approached cautiously, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the debris-strewn path. At the end of the alley was a rusted metal door, slightly ajar. The smell of rot was overwhelming here, mixed with something chemical and sharp. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I pushed the door open. Inside was a long corridor lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The walls were covered in what looked like children's drawings, hundreds of them, all depicting the same thing: a family sitting around a dinner table. But in each drawing, the family members had no mouths, just smooth skin where their mouths should be. I heard sounds from deeper in the building, wet sounds like someone eating soup. I crept forward, my phone recording everything. The corridor opened into a large room that might have once been a factory floor. What I saw there still haunts my dreams. The woman stood in the center of the room, surrounded by industrial refrigerators. But she wasn't alone. There were others, maybe a dozen people, all standing perfectly still in a circle. They had no mouths, just as the drawings depicted. The woman was feeding them, pushing raw meat into slits that would open in their faces where mouths should be, then seal up again. One of them turned toward me. Where its eyes should have been were just two dark holes. It made a sound, a low humming that seemed to come from inside its chest. The others turned too, all facing me with their grotesque, mouthless faces. The woman finally looked directly at me. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "They're so hungry. They're always so hungry. I'm the only one who remembers how to feed them." I backed away slowly, but one of the things moved with impossible speed, blocking the doorway. Up close, I could see its skin was wrong, too smooth, like plastic. It reached for me with hands that had too many joints. I don't remember running. One moment I was in that room, the next I was sprinting through the parking lot of the grocery store, my lungs burning. Bill was waiting by the door, smoking a cigarette. "You followed her, didn't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. "They used to work at the chemical plant before it shut down," he said. "There was an accident. Something got released. The company covered it up. paid off the families to keep quiet. But those who were exposed, they changed. She's the only family member who still takes care of them." He flicked his cigarette into the darkness. "You're lucky. Usually, no one comes back. I quit the next day. Moved out of state within a week. But sometimes, when I'm in a grocery store late at night and I smell raw meat, I think about those things with no mouths, forever hungry, waiting in that abandoned building for their weekly feeding. The woman still comes to that store, Bill tells me, every Thursday at 3:33 a.m. And now there's one more figure in those children's drawings on the walls, one more mouthless face at the dinner table. It looks remarkably like me, the previous tenant. When I found the apartment in downtown Seattle, I couldn't believe my luck. It was well below market rate, spacious, and in a beautiful old building with original hardwood floors and crown molding. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, seemed anxious to rent it quickly. "The previous tenant left suddenly," she explained, averting her eyes. "Family emergency. Very unfortunate. But the apartment is available immediately if you want it." I signed the lease that day. As I was leaving, Mrs. Chen grabbed my wrist. "One thing," she said, "if anyone comes looking for the previous tenant, you don't know anything. You never heard the name David Park. Understand?" It seemed odd, but I was getting such a good deal that I agreed without questioning it further. Moving day was uneventful. The apartment was spotlessly clean, though I noticed some strange marks on the bedroom floor, like someone had dragged something heavy across the wood, leaving deep gouges. There were also small holes in the walls at regular intervals, as if someone had installed and removed multiple locks on the inside of the door. The first week was peaceful. I settled into my new routine, enjoyed the short commute to work, and started making the space my own. Then the visits started. It was a Tuesday night when the first one came. A soft knock at the door, almost hesitant. When I looked through the peephole, I saw a young woman with dark hair and tired eyes. "David," she called softly. "David, I know you're in there. Please, we need to talk." I opened the door with the chain still on. "There's no David here. I just moved in." Her face crumpled. "He said he'd wait for me. He promised. Do you know where he went?" "I'm sorry, I don't know anything about the previous tenant." She stared at me for a long moment, then nodded and left. But I saw her again the next night, standing across the street, looking up at my window. And the night after that. More people came as the weeks went on. An older man who claimed to be David's father, though he looked nothing like the woman who said she was David's sister the following week. A teenager who said David was his tutor. A middle-aged woman who insisted David had borrowed something important from her. None of their stories aligned. None of them looked related. And all of them had the same desperate, hollow look in their eyes. I started keeping a journal of the visits. By the end of the first month, 17 different people had come looking for David Park. I tried searching for him online, but found nothing. No social media, no public records, nothing. One night, I was awakened by someone trying to open my door with a key. The lock turned, but I had installed a deadbolt that could only be opened from inside. The person tried several times, then knocked. "David, it's me. Let me in. I brought what you asked for." The voice was unfamiliar, male, older. I called through the door that they had the wrong apartment. "No," the voice insisted. "This is the right place. You're the one who's wrong." I threatened to call the police, and the person left. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw at least 5 people standing in the hallway, all staring at my door. They stayed there for an hour before silently dispersing. The next day, I confronted Mrs. Chen. She looked terrified when I mentioned the visitors. "You need to leave," she said. "I'll refund your deposit. Just go. Not until you tell me what's going on. Who is David Park?" She glanced around nervously, then pulled me into her office. "I don't know who David Park really was. He lived here for 6 months, paid in cash, kept to himself. But people started coming around, lots of people. Different people every night. They all seemed to know him, but they all had different stories about who he was. What happened to him? One night, about 2 months ago, I heard screaming from his apartment. By the time I got there with my keys, the place was empty, but there was blood on the bedroom floor. A lot of blood. And the walls. There were hundreds of photographs on the walls, all of the same person, but the face was different in each one. Different features, different ages, different ethnicities, but somehow I knew it was all the same person. Did you call the police? Of course. But they found nothing. No DNA matches, no missing persons reports that fit. It was like David Park never existed. I had the apartment cleaned, repainted. I thought it was over. Then you moved in, and they started coming back. That night, I searched the apartment more carefully. Behind the water heater in the closet, I found a loose panel. Inside was a notebook filled with names, addresses, and what looked like detailed personal histories. Each entry was for a different person, complete with backstories, relationships, and habits. There were over 100 entries. At the front of the notebook, written in different handwriting, was a note. To whoever finds this, he's not one person. He's all of us and none of us. He takes what he needs and leaves us hollow. We come looking for him because he has pieces of us we can't live without. But David Park isn't his real name. I don't think he has a real name. I don't think he's real at all. But the holes he leaves in people are real. God help you if he comes back. I moved out that night, staying in a hotel until I could find a new place. Mrs. Chen didn't argue when I broke the lease. As I was leaving, one of the visitors, the young woman from the first night, approached me. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Anything of David's?" I shook my head, but she grabbed my arm. Her grip was ice cold. "He took something from me," she whispered. "I don't remember what, but I know it was important. I can feel the absence of it, like a hole in my chest. We all can. That's why we keep coming back. We're looking for the pieces of ourselves he stole." I pulled away and left, but her words stayed with me. A month later, I started having dreams about the apartment. In the dreams, I was looking for something I'd lost, something vital, but I couldn't remember what it was. I'd wake up with the overwhelming urge to go back to that building, to knock on that door, to ask whoever lived there now if they'd seen David Park. I haven't gone back. Not yet. But the urge gets stronger every day, and I've started to notice things missing from my memory. The name of my first pet, my mother's maiden name, my childhood best friend's face. Small things, but important things. Things that make me who I am. Sometimes I wonder if David Park ever lived in that apartment at all, or if he's something that moves from person to person, taking pieces of identity and leaving behind hollow shells that search endlessly for what they've lost. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself writing in a notebook, documenting the details of my life, as if I'm afraid I'll forget who I am entirely. The really terrifying part? Yesterday, someone knocked on my new apartment door. When I asked who it was, they said they were looking for David Park. They said he used to live here. I didn't open the door, but I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. The reflection. My sister Emma and I inherited our grandmother's house in rural Maine after she passed. It was a beautiful colonial-style home built in the 1920s, sitting on 50 acres of forested land. We decided to spend a month there settling the estate and preparing the house for sale. The house had been modernized over the years, but grandmother had kept certain rooms exactly as they were when she was young. One of these was the parlor, which featured an enormous antique mirror that dominated the entire wall. It was easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, with an ornate gold frame depicting twisted vines and strange faces. That mirror has been in the family for over a century, the estate lawyer told us. Your grandmother's will specifically states it must remain with the house. Emma thought it was creepy, but I found it beautiful in an unsettling way. The glass was old and slightly warped, making reflections appear distorted if you looked at them from certain angles. Sometimes, when walking past, I could swear I saw movement in it that didn't match my own. On our third night in the house, Emma woke me up around 2 a.m. "Alice, there's someone in the parlor," she whispered, shaking my shoulder. We crept down the stairs together, Emma clutching a baseball bat she'd found in the closet. The parlor door was open, moonlight streaming through the windows. The room was empty, but something was wrong with the mirror. Our reflections weren't there. Instead, we could see into what looked like the same parlor, but different. The furniture was arranged differently. The wallpaper was a different pattern, and standing in the center of that other room was a woman in a Victorian-era dress. She was facing away from us, perfectly still. As we watched, frozen in place, she slowly turned around. Her face was our grandmother's, but young, maybe 20 years old. She looked directly at us and mouthed a single word: "Run." Behind her, shadows began to move. They detached from the walls and started taking shape, becoming tall, impossibly thin figures with elongated limbs. The young version of our grandmother backed away from them, terror clear on her face. Emma grabbed my arm. "We need to leave. Now." But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by what was happening in the mirror. The shadow figures surrounded young grandmother, reaching for her with hands that seemed to stretch and distort. She screamed, but no sound came through the glass. Then one of the shadow figures turned toward us. Even though it had no discernible features, I could feel it looking at us. It moved toward the mirror's surface from the other side. As it got closer, the glass began to ripple like water. A hand pushed through. Not a normal hand, but something black and twisted, with too many joints and fingers that branched like tree limbs. It grasped the frame and began pulling something through. Emma hit the mirror with the baseball bat. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. The thing pulling itself through recoiled, and suddenly our reflections returned. We were staring at ourselves, pale and terrified, the bat still raised. We ran back to our rooms and didn't come out until sunrise. The next day, we searched the house for information about the mirror. In the attic, we found our grandmother's journals from when she was young. The entries about the mirror were deeply disturbing. Age 16. Mother says I must never look in the parlor mirror after midnight. She won't say why, but I've seen her standing in front of it at night, talking to someone who isn't there. Age 18. I looked. God forgive me, I looked. There's another house in the mirror, another family. They look like us, but they're wrong. Their smiles are too wide, their movements too fluid. They watch us. Age 20. They're trying to switch places with us. I can feel them pushing against the glass at night. Mother says our family has been guarding the mirror for generations, keeping them contained. But they're getting stronger. Age 21. Sarah looked too long. She switched. The thing wearing Sarah's face lives with us now. We pretend not to notice that she doesn't blink, that her reflection shows her true form. Mother says it's the price we pay for keeping the others contained. The entries jumped to when grandmother was much older. Asterisk age 73. I'm the last one who knows the truth. The others have all forgotten or chosen not to believe. But the mirror must stay with the house. It's a door that must never fully open. I've spent my life making sure of that. When I'm gone,